Continuing now with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's The Final Days. Now we begin Chapter 6. After the meeting with Haig and Bazart, the president walked through the Rose Garden portico to the residence. Inside, uniformed members of the Executive Protection Service straightened to attention. Nixon followed the ground floor passageway past the portraits of former First Ladies to the arched entrance of the residence elevator. At the third floor, he stepped out, and as he walked up the ramp, he straightened from his stooped posture just before he reached the solarium. The 9 Republican senators who were waiting for him there had been the core of the president's support within his own party. They represented both the right and the moderate wings. Their constituents wanted to know why Nixon deserved such unquestioning loyalty. The senators were concerned about the party and their careers. They could not take any more of the revelations that had been filling the newspapers. They had to know if they could stand behind their president. They wanted his personal assurance. He gave it. He was innocent. He would prove it. The nation needed a strong president. He needed their support to be strong. They pledged it. The president's top political aides, Timmons, Bryce Harlow, and Tom Coroligus, were there to see that nothing in the way of White House hospitality was lacking. The senators stayed for cocktails. Nixon left with Haig, who had stopped by to mingle. As they walked, the president wondered aloud what Bazart had found in Haldeman's files. Haig needed no further hint. He rushed dutifully to the file room. Bazart had just gotten the originals from Higbee. Haig grabbed the notes and turned to run back. Bazart stopped him in mid-stride and directed Haig's attention to page 2 of Haldeman's notes. Haig read, "What is our counterattack? PR offensive to top this, hit the opposition with their activities, point out libertarians have created public clamor, ? Do they justify this less than stealing Pentagon Papers, Anderson file, etc.? We should be on the attack for diversion." Haig was really upset now. There might be some question as to exactly what was said during the meeting. There might be some question as to who or what had obliterated the stretch of tape. But there was no question about one thing. The gap wiped out a discussion of Watergate. Haig went to tell the president. Bazart and Powers returned to the task of listening to the subpoenaed conversations, wondering whether more tapes had gaps. The next tape discussion of June 30th, 1972 encouraged them. The material was intact, and most of it was privileged, unrelated to Watergate. They reached September 15th, 1972, a discussion about Watergate involving Haldeman, Dean, and the president. Dean had testified that the president had told him in this conversation, "Bob tells me what a good job you've been doing, John." Would the tape support Nixon's contention that he didn't know much about the cover-up when the original indictments were returned that day? A footnote says those indictments were against Hunt, Liddy, and the 5 men arrested inside the Watergate on June 17, 1972. The lawyers heard the president praise Dean's work. "The way you've handled it has been very skillful, because you putting your fingers in the dikes every time that leaks have sprung here and sprung there." But it was impossible to know exactly what Nixon was referring to. The conversation was troublesomely ambiguous. Bazart and Powers were more disturbed by another part. The president was discussing the Washington Post and its lawyer, Edward Bennett Williams, with Dean. "I wouldn't want to be in Edward Bennett Williams' position after this election," the president said. "We are going to fix the son of a bitch, believe me. We are going to. We've got to, because he is a bad man." Another of the president's remarks was equally damaging. "The main thing is, the Post is going to have damnable problems out of this one. They have a television station, and they're going to have to get it renewed," the president said. Dean mentioned how common the practice of filing challenges to license renewals have become. "It is going to be goddamn active here," the president shot back. The president's remarks worried Bazart and Powers, but they decided this portion of the conversation did not technically relate to Watergate. They would claim it as privilege and see if Sirica would uphold them. A third segment was more disturbing. Dean complained that the IRS was not cooperating with him in his efforts to uncover damaging information about one of the contributors to the campaign of Democratic presidential candidate George McGovern. The president was outraged. "Well, goddamn, they ought to give it to you," he told Dean. Nixon went on to plan how after the election he would make sure that the IRS became more cooperative. He would fire IRS Commissioner Johnny Walters for his failure to cooperate. Then he threatened to fire his Secretary of the Treasury, the cabinet officer responsible for the IRS. "I don't want George Shultz to ever raise the question because it would put me in the position of having to throw him out of office," the president said. "He didn't get to be Secretary of the Treasury because he has nice blue eyes. It was a goddamn favor to him to get the job." This was exactly the kind of presidential abuse of power which the impeachment clause of the Constitution was intended to remedy, Bozart observed. The president was planning to use a federal agency for blatantly political purposes. But, strictly speaking, it too had nothing to do with Watergate. They would claim it as privileged on the off chance that Sirica would see it their way. Bozart expectantly threaded the March 21, 1973 tape onto the recorder. Nixon rested almost the whole of his case on this date, claiming that Dean had first informed him then of the details of the cover-up. For all its importance, the president had never listened to this tape. He had relied instead on Haldeman's reading, which matched his own recollection that when he was told that day that the Watergate burglars were demanding $1 million as the price of their continued silence, Nixon rejected the blackmail decisively. It would be wrong. It would not work. The truth would come out anyway. John Dean was claiming differently. Nixon and Dean also disagreed as to whether the president had rejected the notion of granting the burglars executive clemency. Bozart listened as Dean led the president through a relatively inoffensive discussion of Patrick Gray's confirmation hearings as chief of the FBI and of how to keep the Senate Judiciary Committee from getting FBI files. The conversation led Nixon to a favorite subject, telephone tapping by Democrats. When, he asked, was Bill Sullivan of the FBI going to bring over the list of offenses committed by previous administrations? "As soon as you get that, I'll be available to talk to you this afternoon," he told Dean. Bozart could hear the enthusiasm in the president's voice as he contemplated what Sullivan might have. Dean solemnly changed the subject. "The reason I thought we ought to talk this morning is because in our conversations I have the impression that you don't know everything I know." "That's right," the president said, his voice returning to normal. Bozart relaxed. Dean and the president were going to corroborate what the president had been insisting on all along, that Dean had been off on his own. Dean alerted Nixon to the quote, cancer, and then summed up how the cover-up had progressed through the summer of 1972 and the following winter. The problem was growing daily, geometrically, compounding itself. "That'll be clear as I explain some of the details," Dean said. "It is basically because, one, we're being blackmailed, and two, people are going to start perjuring themselves very quickly that have not had to perjure themselves to protect other people and the like." Bozart could not have been more pleased. It was as the president had said. Dean was explaining Watergate to the president for the first time. He played it back for Powers and then let the tape run. He could hear Dean clearly. He strained to hear the president's voice. "How much money do you need?" Nixon asked. "I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next 2 years. "We could get that," Nixon added. "I mean, you could get the money. You could get $1 million. And you could get it in cash. I know where it could be gotten. I mean, it's not easy, but it could be done." Bozart waited to hear the president say it would be wrong. "But the question is, who the hell would handle it?" Nixon droned on instead. "Any ideas on that?" The president and his young aide discussed who could be relied on to raise the money. The payments to the burglars might be made under the cover of a Cuban Defense Committee. It could be concealed from a grand jury. Bozart's brief optimism faded as he listened to Nixon and Dean conspire. 4 times the president discussed ways to accommodate the blackmail demands, never once implying that it would be wrong. Hunt was demanding $120,000 immediately. "Well, your major guy to keep under control is Hunt," the president suggested. "Don't you, just looking at the immediate problem, don't you have to handle Hunt's financial situation damn soon?" Nixon answered his own question. It was necessary to keep the cap on the bottle that much in order to have any options. Powers noticed a sour expression on Bozart's face. Dean told Nixon that the situation was so dangerous that aides would soon begin toppling like dominoes, and finally they collapsed backward on the president. Until finally they collapsed backward on the president. Dean was worried about being charged with obstruction of justice. He had been the conduit for paying the defendants. The president seemed to be getting the point. Oh, you mean like the blackmail? The blackmail, right. Well, said the president, I wonder if that part of it can't be, I wonder if that doesn't, let me put it frankly, I wonder if that doesn't have to be continued. Bazart shook his head and turned one earphone toward Powers. Let me put it this way, the president went on. Let us suppose that you get the $1 million, and you get the proper way to handle it, and you could hold that side. It would seem to me that would be worthwhile. Clearing his throat, Dean started to respond, but the president interrupted. Now we have one problem. You have the problem of Hunt and his clemency. Bazard and Powers exchanged glances. It was not, after all, Dean who had raised the subject of clemency. That's right, Dean agreed. Nixon had defined the problem. And you're going to have the clemency problem for the others, Dean said. They all would expect to be out, and that may put you in a position that's just untenable at some point. I'm not sure that you will ever be able to deliver on the clemency. It may just be too hot. It was not the president who had suggested that clemency was out of the question, but Dean. By now, Bazart was expecting still worse. Nixon delivered. You can't do it until after the 74 elections, that's for sure, said the president. But even then, your point is that even then you couldn't do it. He sounded disappointed. That's right, said Dean. It may further involve you in a way you shouldn't be involved in this. The president agreed. No, it's wrong, that's for sure. At last, that was what the president considered his decisive rejection of meeting the burglars' blackmail demands. It was about the clemency, not the blackmail. Even on that count, the president seemed to have gone along for practical political reasons, and not until Dean had told him it probably wouldn't work. Bazart listened to Nixon as he kept looking for a solution. Dean estimated that Ehrlichman was probably vulnerable to indictment by the grand jury for soliciting the money that had been going out for months to the burglars. But what I am coming to you today with is, I don't have a plan of how to solve it right now, but I think it's at the juncture that we should begin to think in terms of how to cut the losses, how to minimize the further growth of this thing, rather than further compound it by, ultimately paying these guys forever. I think we've got to look. President interrupted impatiently. But at the moment, don't you agree that you better get the Hunt thing? I mean, that's worth it at the moment. The president wanted Hunt paid off. He didn't want to be told that it wouldn't work. Bazart heard Haldeman enter. Mercifully, the tape was approaching its end as Nixon led the search for ways, quote, to take care of the jackasses who are in jail. 6 more times the president returned to the subject of the blackmail, and then he restated his conclusion. For your immediate thing, you've got no choice with Hunt but the $120,000 or whatever it is, right? That's right, Dean agreed. Would you agree that that's a by-time thing and that you'd better damn well get that done but fast? The president asked. I think he ought to be given some signal anyway, Dean said. Well, for Christ's sake, Nixon continued, get it in a way that who's going to talk to him? Colson? He's the one who's supposed to know him. Well, Colson doesn't have any money, though, Dean noted. That's the thing. That's been one of the real problems. They were broke. Someone remembered a secret $350,000 stash in the White House. The press had already learned about it. We are so goddamn square that we get caught on everything, Haldeman laughed. It was a moment of singular truth amidst the squalor. Bazart reflected. He marveled at their resourcefulness. In the course of the discussion, the president had considered almost every conceivable alternative. Granting Hunt parole instead of clemency, using priests to help hide payments to the burglars, washing money through Las Vegas or New York, bookmakers, convening a new grand jury before which the president's men would plead the Fifth Amendment or experience memory failure, co-opting the assistant attorney general by having him appointed as a special Watergate prosecutor, everything but telling the truth. Finally, they agreed to send John Mitchell out on an emergency fundraising mission. Haldeman, Dean, and the president were discussing the logistics. Then Bazart heard the worst part of all. It was what he had dreaded. The president was addressing Dean. You had the right plan, let me say. I have no doubts about the right plan before the election, and you handled it just right. You contained it. Now, after the election, we've got to have another plan. Bizart sat for a few minutes after the machine had stopped, considering what to do. He and Powers finished the analysis and indexing, and then Bizart went to see Leonard Garment. Maybe Garment would have an idea. On the evening of November 17th, the president faced an audience of several hundred newspaper editors in a question and answer session scheduled as part of his campaign to regain credibility. The session began badly. The president, agitated and combative, confused his syntax several times. Reporters, he observed, quote, answered tough questions. He referred to himself as he. When asked whether he still considered Haldeman and Ehrlichman two of the finest public servants he had known, he responded, I hold that both men and others who have been charged are guilty until we have evidence that they are not guilty. He was asked about his low tax payments, reported at $792 in 1970 and $878 in 1971. Bobbing on his feet and gripping the podium with both hands, he gave a rambling account of his finances, not of the period in question, but of more than a decade earlier. In 1960, after 14 years as a congressman, senator, and vice president, his net worth was $47,000, quote, and a 1958 Oldsmobile that needed an overhaul, he said. Watching the performance on television, Bizart and Garment pondered the president's strange demeanor. As he completed his answer, they felt Nixon was addressing them. In all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook, said Richard Nixon. Bizart and Garment knew they were already treading perilously close to the cover-up line. The 18.5-minute gap was not something about which they could wait and see if the prosecutors asked the right question. This was not about a proposal to manufacture evidence. This was destruction of evidence. The lawyers were certain there was no innocent explanation, and they wanted the gap disclosed at once to the special prosecutor. If Jaworski were to learn about it secondhand, after the subpoenaed tape was turned over to Sirica, he might draw the inference that the president's lawyers had conspired to hide the destruction from investigators. The lawyers did not ask Nixon for permission to inform the special prosecutor. They simply told the president their intention. They met with Jaworski on the morning of Wednesday, November 21st at his office. Bizart proposed that a joint investigation be undertaken by the special prosecutor and the White House to determine the cause of the gap. Not unexpectedly, Jaworka insisted that Sirica be informed of the gap at once. That afternoon, the day before Thanksgiving, Bizart, Garment, and Jaworski met in chambers with Sirica for a secret conference. Your Honor, Bizart began. He tried to soften the blow. While listening to one of the 7 remaining tapes, he had encountered a new problem. The intelligence is not available for approximately 18 minutes. There is an obliteration of the intelligence for approximately 18 minutes. You can't hear the voices. Bizart paused. It doesn't appear from what we know at this point that it could have been accidental. Does not appear? Sirica was puzzled. At its worst, it looks like a very serious thing, Your Honor. If there is an explanation, quite frankly, I don't know what it is at the moment. The missing portion was part of the conversation of June 20th, 1972, 3 days after the arrests inside the Watergate. Quote, between the president and Mr. Haldeman. It would indicate Mr. Haldeman was there talking to the president, Sirica asked. Yes. Then there is a lapse. Yes, then the circumstance is even a little worse than that, Your Honor. I don't know how it could get much worse. Just wait, interjected Garment. We found Mr. Haldeman's notes of this meeting, said Bizart. They consist of 2 legal pads of paper. The notes reflect that the discussion was about Watergate. Later that afternoon, Sirica made the matter public and ordered an immediate inquiry to be conducted in open court. For the next 2 weeks, news of the gap filled the nation's front pages. Bizart, Haig, Woods, Bull, Secret Service personnel, and other White House aides were called to the witness stand to explain. Woods was a star witness. She steadfastly maintained that she had accidentally erased about 5 minutes of the conversation, no more, while talking on the telephone. The photograph released by the White House to support her testimony was cruel. It pictured the president's secretary contorted at her desk, one arm flung back to a phone, a foot on the transcribing pedal. The statements were inconsistent. Witnesses could not agree on dates, or whether recording machines were examined for malfunction, or when tapes had been checked out. Woods had kept certain tapes locked in her desk. Others had been taken to Key Biscayne. Others had been given to Haldeman to take home. Sirica referred the matter to the panel of technical experts he had appointed to determine why the two tapes were missing. In the White House, the president was angry about how the whole episode had been handled. He spent hours talking to Woods and Rebozo about how all of Watergate, this problem and the ones before, seemed somehow to derive from the incompetence of his lawyers. He was growing increasingly furious. On November 29th, he instructed Ziegler to announce that the legal team had made, quote, some mistakes, and accordingly was being reorganized. It was a clear statement of no confidence. Haig expressed his private distress to the lawyers. The president was cutting them off at the knees. If we're going to do this, I'll quit, Haig told Bizard. Bizard and Garment went to see Nixon. Now subdued, Nixon asserted that Ziegler had issued the statement without consulting him. He looked away from Bizard as he spoke. He would order Ziegler to issue a clarifying statement. The exchange bolstered Bizard's belief that Nixon was the most transparent liar he had ever met. Ziegler approached Bizard later very upset. Mrs. Bizard was with her husband. Ziegler insisted that he had acted on the president's specific orders and asked Mrs. Bizard if she would ever speak to him again. Yes, she would. Yes, she said. Sure, of course. She was used to government. Afterward, meeting with Haig, Bizard was succinct. He would adopt, he said, the dilatory approach in defending the president. If there was a reasonable way to explain the president's conduct, he would try. But he could no longer pretend, even to himself, that his client was a helpless victim of Watergate. The tapes, what was left of them, made that clear. At best, Bizard and the other lawyers could try to establish the president's technical innocence. We are officers of the court, he warned Haig. If in a file or tape search we come across a smoking pistol, we've got to disclose it. Still, he would proceed slowly, Bizard assured Haig. He would not search for the weapon. Nor would Haig. On December 6th, from the witness stand in Sirica's courtroom, the general speculated that quote, some sinister force had been responsible for the tape gap. Has anyone ever suggested who that sinister force might be? The judge asked. No, Your Honor, Haig replied. At the White House, Jan Barberi, a secretary in the speechwriting shop, pasted a picture of Bela Lugosi on a lampshade. Beneath the picture she typed, sinister force. And if you don't know, Bela Lugosi was an actor back in the first half of the 20th century who often played Dracula, the vampire, and other horror pictures as well. Garment reflected on the situation. Missing tapes, gaps, sinister forces, suggestions to manufacture evidence, lawyers on the witness stand, a client and old friend who would not hear his advice. But he was not really surprised. He had seen Richard Nixon lock himself into unreality and depression before. Garment went to see Haig. I want out, he said. Technical innocence was not enough. He could not function as a lawyer under these circumstances. It was a charade. Haig was sympathetic. Given the peril of the situation, I can't accept the fact that all the information is derivative, Garment said. Everything came to the lawyers indirectly, almost never from the client they were supposed to be defending. Haig was impressed by Garment's refined language, his precise mind, his sense of humor. But Garment was a panicker in his view, not a man to hang in for the tough battle. In war, one had to risk his own ass. Haig was willing. Garment wasn't. Garment elaborated on his position. He did not wish to do anything that would suggest disloyalty or defeatism. He would stay on at the White House, but he would drop out of sight. He could deal with cultural affairs, American Indians. There would be no noise. He would not resign. More in sadness than in anger, Garment recounted how he had hoped there would be some tapes or some evidence to prove the president's innocence. They didn't seem to exist. Garment wasn't blaming anyone. The real meaning of Watergate, he told Haig, was to be found in the passive acceptance of hiring two men, Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, and then standing by letting it all happen. And after that, still a more passive acceptance about how to handle Hunt and Liddy's exposure in an election year. The tapes that Bizard had described to him were so unclear, so ambiguous, he observed, like every conversation in the Oval Office, he said. Haig was in perfect accord. Garment began to reminisce about conversations in the Oval Office. Someone would say, let's bomb Tel Aviv. Now that's not policy, but the tape would sound bad. While you're kicking around policy decisions, things come up. So the president told Dean, good job, John. The president said it, but he always says good job. Haig agreed. He'll say good job, Lynn, on this or that. He says it when it has been a bad job, or no job at all. Often it has been no job, but it becomes good job, Lynn. The president is guilty of misdemeanors. It is inherent in the office. Garment thought back to the weekend when the president had discussed Haldeman and Ehrlichman, calling them, quote, two of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know. That dissonant phrase should have rung several million alarm bells across the country, he realized. If Haldeman and Ehrlichman were such fine servants, why had the president gotten rid of them? The day after their departure, Nixon arrived at a cabinet meeting trembling with anger. Passing the offices of his former aides, he had found FBI agents stationed outside to secure their papers and files. It was an outrage, an insult to the integrity of two great and good men, Nixon said. Who had ordered the FBI agents posted, he demanded. Who was it? He wanted them out of the government immediately, fired. He would see that somebody paid the price. In fact, Garment was responsible. He had raised the matter with Richardson and Ruckelshaus, and they had agreed that agents should be posted immediately, but no names were volunteered during the cabinet meeting. The president calmed down only when he seemed to perceive that his own cabinet appeared concerned about his behavior. In the following weeks and months, Nixon repeatedly urged Haig to set up a mechanism to raise funds, either in secret or through public channels, for Haldeman and Ehrlichman's legal defense. Garment had advised Haig that it was out of the question, but Nixon pressed. If the Berrigans could have a defense fund, why not Haldeman and Ehrlichman? Eventually, however, Nixon seemed reconciled to the idea that no one on the White House staff would undertake the mission. The decision to fire Haldeman and Ehrlichman must have consumed the president with guilt, Garment thought. He felt tremendous compassion for Nixon. An act of both conscience and cowardice, Garment thought of his own decision to abandon the president's defense. And thus ends Chapter 6. We'll take up in the next session with Chapter 7 of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thank you for watching.